Go ahead. You
Recording.
can introduce us.
What's going on, everybody? I am Free Beer tomorrow, joined by the big Signorelli himself,
Master Signified
reconstructed
Bodies.
through free
Dirk Ziegler.
association. Here again, and today, for a nice change of pace, we're going to be talking about Lacan.
Yeah. What's
The
the name of this
Jacques.
chapter?
This is chapter 18 of seminar 2, Desire, Life, and Death. Not a fan of the Oxford comma, I see. The editors of this volume, this
Yeah.
version of
And
seminar
maybe
2.
maybe because since we're talking about libido and this continuation of insistence, it's like it's not life, comma, and death, but life and death, you know.
Oh, right. Yeah, maybe.
Maybe that. Or maybe it could be the not a fan of the Oxford comma.
No, I think you're right there.
But yeah, and it's not like this sort of yin yang. Oh, there's this like balance between life and death. Like, no, it's like there's a split between, the two, and pretty much they're constructed by this symbolic order.
Yeah, you caught me trying to ride for the Oxford comma when it wasn't
Hey,
even necessary.
hey, we'll still keep them accountable. We'll sock check them.
Sock check the Oxford comma. That's right. This is a really great chapter, everybody. There's a lot to dig into. So we're gonna start right away. This chapter is coming on the heels of what we talked about last week, a little bit of Oedipus, questions for the teacher. We got into dreams. Lacan fielded various questions about the technique that he's been expatiating upon up until this point. And in this one, I feel like a lot really comes together. And by the end, you'll see that he's really spazzing out.
Right. And I like this departure he talks about. He's like, we're at the radical crossroads of the Freudian position. And he says it's like what's at stake pretty much is desire. And what one ought to do is know how to listen, because that's what's speaking is desire, and the relationship between desire, libido, and even speech, right? And how the symptom manifests itself as a language, a metaphor, etc. And he puts this in perspective when we talk about desire. So what's the basis of our experience now, since we're talking about the element of desire, which structures, again, the unconscious, or the unconscious is structured like a language, and desire is part of that. So he's like, are we talking about an anthropology, a cosmology? There's no word for it. And one thing I want to kind of bring out is the fact that his notion of desire, right? Desire is the desire of the other, comes from Kojève, and it's the Kojèvian interpretation of Hegel. This shows the need for recognition, and yet he kind of goes beyond this because he realizes that recognition cannot be gained from the other. This demand and desire in the unconscious that wants recognition from the big other, and it can never get it because the big other is this virtual, let's just say thing, even though it's not a thing, but part of the whole circuit of language. And yet he's probably going to build this up to understand the difference between the big other and the little other in the next chapter. But we could see how situating somebody as the big other, a little other, fails to take on that role. Therefore, they fail to get recognition because they're getting recognition. They want recognition from the big O.
Right. And it's like they think they want recognition from the big O, but what they can never secure is what lies in ignorance, a knowledge that does not know itself, and the entire gamble of being human, in a sense of being a part of the symbolic order, everything is staked on what the subject cannot secure
Right.
recognition for, and the idea that the big other would, in some sense, register it would also lead to the complete dissolution
Yeah.
of the split that is constitutive of subjectivity. So really, what's desired is also not desired, is endlessly displaced, because so long as the subject can never gain full recognition, it continues as a subject.
Right, exactly. And pretty much what he's doing is going beyond anthropology. And I guess why he brings up cosmology is the fact it's like, well, what is at stake with the symbolic order then? What was, what arose from, to create the symbolic order? Or maybe just the fact it's like we need to go beyond like these common discourses because the Freudian experience
When
brings
I
up.
think, sorry, go ahead.
No. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, like, when I think cosmology, I was thinking back to lectures prior when he was talking about the figure of the monarch or the royal couple, and he mentions cosmology in regards to their function,
Right.
which I don't know if that's what he's evoking here, but that's what comes to mind. Because when I think of cosmology, I think of the myth of the sexual relation in some
Yeah.
sense. And then when I think of anthropology, I think of Levi Strauss.
Right. And yeah, I would definitely, that definitely does. I agree with that too. And another thing with cosmology and in anthropology, in the framework that they may be, trying to, well, at least prior to Levi Strauss, you could see as like this enlightenment style of thinking of stages and becoming that enlightened individual, right? We get from the European Enlightenment, and cosmology having to do with the creation of the universe and a sort of aim. Again, this teleology that no matter what, every time we let God out of the front door, we let him back into the
Right.
back door. And that's what the Freudian experience allows us to dismantle or displace, especially when we come with desire, because it's not on the level of the imaginary of human understanding and freedom. It's actually something that shows, the ego is not the master of its home. And so this is why we have to realize, maybe psychoanalysis could help us understand these discourses a lot better, but psychoanalysis takes itself into account as a discourse because language itself is incomplete. Therefore, we can't have a full meta language.
Right. And it's like what he's doing here, bring up anthropology, cosmology, is what he's been doing from the beginning of this seminar, which is to try to disambiguate the Freudian project from a kind of anthropology, cosmology, or historicization of, well, humanism.
Yeah.
And it's like, what's interesting is this leads us to his first exploration in this chapter of the concept of libido, which I find so interesting because here libido sets the place for death drive. But right now he doesn't have a fully developed concept of death drive, at least as it will be contrasted with Freud's understanding of death drive, which was still very gestational.
Yeah.
But here it's like, I like how he defines libido, because I think some of these aspects, some of these details play into what will eventually be more of a sort of safe haven of concepts we're more familiar with, like jouissance and death drive. But there are certain nuances that you can pick up here that make really clarify how death drive works. For instance, here when he talks about this unit of quantitative measurement, it's a unit which one does not know how to measure, but you always assume to be there. This is really a dialectic. It only explains the interplay of different forces, but in its explanation of the interplay of different forces also does not entify those forces.
Right.
Just like the unconscious only exists in the moments it comes into being, it also vanishes. This is going to, and now I feel like I'm sort of like waffling and I'm all over the place, but in Alenka Zupancic's discussion of the Sphinx riddle that Oedipus solves, she also draws on this idea of a knowledge that's half said, half lived, and the signifier that appears and disappears in the very same moment. This is sort of like what I think of as libido. We can't think of libido as something that, in any cosmological sense, pre-exists the subject, pre-exists the individual who is, let's say, when you're talking about stages, fully initiated into the symbolic order, which we know is an impossibility. That's just a myth of full initiation, the myth of genital love. No, the libido in this sense is not the Jungian cosmological libido. It is the libido which is a necessary explanation for two different, I don't want to call them realms, I don't want to call them domains necessarily, but two, how would you put it, two dialectically kindred realities that almost don't match up.
Yeah, they don't
bounce off of each other.
They're not something that are complementary, especially with the whole Jungian thing, because it implies like, oh, that like there's this complete universal energy that has like something that's archaic and archetypal, but also aims at a positive transformation to make, you know, the self, the individual, something that, and he talks, Lacan mentions this, that Jung sees this process as very reductive because it wants to place libido in, like there is this primitive sexuality to it, but that's only how it starts, and then it starts to develop into a more imago or complete form, which is very Platonic, like whether or not he wants to admit it, but it has no notion of like deviation, or like I don't even think he really uses sublimation in the same sense as Freud, because we're talking about repression and enjoyment. For him, it's just, again, this universal transformation, very reductive to Lacan. I mentioned just now deviation, but that when we talk about how libido forms, he doesn't have a theory of desire, and this is what he's wanting to emphasize, that for Freud, he's getting at something of desire. And in the three essays, we talk about libido having an object of satisfaction, but it's never really external to libido itself. In fact, it is a manifestation of libido, and it even goes so far as to keep it at bay, to keep enjoying. And we see how, if we take stage theory seriously, then how the notion of libido, narcissism as the sexual object, and even the death drive, or just drives themselves in the Freudian Lacanian notion, then it undermines any evolution towards a telos or a final cause.
Right, which is as early as three essays on sexuality, libido, although it's not what it will culminate in when Freud gets to beyond the pleasure principle, and that's not to say libido is death drive necessarily, but if you think about even the way those essays are ordered, and the way he anticipates the introduction of this theme of libido, you notice that he's in the very structure of the essays themselves trying to deliberately upset any illusion that there is a purpose or telos, as you're saying, to libido, in this sense that we don't have these stages. And I think this is what Lacan is describing here, in that, well, one, I like what he says here, this recourse to a notion of a threshold, that of a level of invariability, which on the surface of it suggests this very Platonic idea of identity, of that which remains invariable throughout all stages of change. But that in itself almost implies stages.
Right.
I can't say exactly how, I'm just spitballing here, but this idea that libido resolves itself and resolves the individual is the solution to the lack that the individual encounters at a young age, as if it is in itself not lack, as if it isn't the joint or the absent joint between two different moments.
No, exactly. And that's the main thing, is that there's lack. And what Lacan points out is that, well, there, of course, he situates in this seminar, for the most part, death drive within the symbolic order, right? And insistence that happens in it. Although when he introduces the real, there's this aspect which, of course, can't exist without the machine. And yet there are gaps in it. And we could see where the real cannot symbolize anything, and also doesn't allow for ego identification in the the form of the dreams that we see in Irma's injection, to really create these combinations and account for itself, or the subject, as we should say, because that's what's at stake, and the subject is caught within desire, right? But this aspect of the real, this aspect of insistence, undermines this telos, and lack is really why we desire, right? And that's something that you mentioned, how maybe we shouldn't compare libido to drive, or maybe it's not the same thing. I would say it is the same thing, in the fact that Freud doesn't have like a magnum opus per se, and in all his different writings, he's attacking a different problem, questioning the framework, and taking the scientific method to its absolute limit and the deadlocks. We could see how in the way we read Freud in these play writings, how libido, narcissism, and then the beyond the pleasure principle tie in, because if libido's symbolically constituted, well, there's also prohibitions of an impossibility. And there's also a lack that is structured from the symbolic order. We're told, right, oh, enjoy this, don't enjoy that. So you're already at a sort of contradiction or deadlock within libido or death drive itself.
Yeah, no, I think it is the same thing for sure. I think that the cyclical movement of death drive isn't always suggested by the term libido. So just trying to distinguish it, only maybe I'm periodizing myself something that is resisting periodization, because libido, Freud's thought itself shouldn't necessarily be separated into stages, although there are qualitative differences. But I think it's like what we're getting at here is what he says in this paragraph, which is every theory ends up with a world, this terminus ad quem, which means, I looked that up, the terminal point of a body of knowledge. And the phrase that he used earlier in this seminar, which I know Foucault uses a lot, is episteme, which I think of as a completed body of knowledge, a closed system where there may be a hierarchy of knowledge, where concepts are arranged in a way like a taxonomical way that is somehow meant to be reflective of the structure of reality in some sense. Desire, libido completely, as you were saying, undermine anything like a set structure, but not only in the sense of this kind of relativistic, oh, there's always something that escapes whatever structure. It's not even so much escape, it's that it cuts through structure. It's the stain spreading through structure. Or what I was just reading in Alenka, Ethics of the Real, when she quotes Zizek, that the symbolic order is what fills the void opened by the impossibility of the symbolic order.
Right. Yeah. And I like that. And I want to add on, because you mentioned Foucault, I would say even we could bring up Heidegger in that, every episteme or techne, every discipline, including, of course, the question about philosophy, is being, because anthropology is always inquiring a being. But what being is it? What is the being of anthropology? What is the being of biology? And what is the being of being in philosophy? And yet that's always being concealed. And we have to be able to, understand this discourse, dismantle it so that we could disclose that being, qua being, just sound sophisticated. But there is a truth to that. And that's what Lacan seems like he's getting at with this. But it's not this primordial being that discloses itself to being in a phenomenological, hermeneutical aspect. In fact, it is maybe you could say non-being of the subject, because it's not localized. It's always where it is not, or where you least expect it, barred by desire.
Right. It's funny because desire itself remains unconscious within Freud's system, at least as a name.
Yeah.
Which that is part of Lacan's whole MO, which would be to sift through Freud's system to find the evidence of his own system in play, his own terminological coordinates within Freud, even though he says, well, this is Freud's idea. Freud's all about desire. Yes and no, but not so much as a term. But it's a theory. It's a theory of desire. What do you think he means here by theoria, an intuition, contemplation? I was wondering if that's in some sense a contrast to episteme.
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I would say maybe it does have to contrast with an episteme insofar like we're talking about particular sciences, although like maybe you could say that in some ways certain schools of philosophy have been reduced to an episteme. Maybe theoria has to do with like a more phenomenological or philosophical sense, like of concepts, of notion. But I don't know. That was a good question that of something that I've overlooked because I didn't really compare the two.
I didn't look it up either, but I know you'll have a lot to say here, which is that with the libido, of course, he's not just using this as a lens through which he can criticize two-body psychology or ego psychology, but also show what the limitations of object relation theory are. And that what's interesting is that this idea of stages, as he says, all correspond to the ushering in of a new object, which we were just talking about with philosophy, techne. Techne, it carves out the space for an object that would be suitable for its technique. It's as if the libido in the stage theory, I don't know if I'm using stage theory correctly there, but like in this idea of object relations would create an object at each stage.
Exactly.
Libido is what generates this object, and he's saying, but no, the object is a non-object. Libido
Yes.
has an objective in a sense, but it's a non-object.
Yeah. And they probably wouldn't, the object relations would probably see themselves as seeing an object in the philosophical sense of like the subject object duality. And yet it seems like they fall victim to it, because at first they talk about libido and they desexualize it. Right. They don't see it as the Freudian Lacanian theory of sexuality. They may see, in aspects of it sexual, or people having sexual erotic fantasies, but they think that if we sexualize a libido, then it's reductive. And we already know the Zupančič question. It's like those who say, oh, Freud reduces everything about sex. Well, it's like, well, what do you mean by sex, right? You're being reductive by assuming sex as something, a set of practices rather than a deadlock, right? A contradiction. So they will then see that, oh yeah, the object of the child is the mother or the mother's breast, which represents the object of affection, and then they're supposed to transition through it and then develop integrated object relations. But these objects are always positive, even though when in the process of individuating from their mother, the mother may introduce a sort of complex into them. I'm using complex as a sort of nonchalant term loosely, but it creates an internalized split of a good and bad object. So right there, it's like, okay, you're onto something, because it's not a whole object, but at the same time, it's in this imaginary relationship that doesn't see how desire or another part of libido is structuring this antagonism. And then the point is to integrate it to a healthy sense of object relations, which is libido in a non-sexual way. So right here, you already have a positive relation that's different from what you identified as that libido has a non-object, and yet it's still sexual because, well, we could describe it as not only being constituted by the symbolic order, but that it's sexual in the sense that libido becomes lured by this image, the mirror stage, the narcissism, which is a sexual object because it creates this libidinal investment in a fragmented image of the body, which when we talk about Lacan later on, we talk about sexuation, the phallus, etc. We can just see how that ties in. We don't have to necessarily elaborate through that, but that we see how sexuality is not reducible to stuff in the bedroom or anything along that lines. It has nothing to do with gender. It has everything to do with this excess of enjoyment, which we're situated in by language, and yet language can't obtain it all because there's prohibitions of enjoyment.
And that's why in Zupančič's book, what is sex is italicized.
Yeah.
Which I hadn't noticed. It wasn't until I listened to her Machinic Unconscious episode and heard her mention that. Mm-hmm. It occurred to me that yes, the is of sex is important in that we can't locate the identity of sex on a cosmological basis, on an anthropological basis. It's that lack that he's talking about right here. That lack becomes sort of the axis
Right.
of the subject, in that like it is the exchanged gift, so to speak, for entrance into the symbolic order, and also, strangely enough, gained back.
Yeah.
That makes very little sense. I know
Well,
that sounds abstruse, but I think what is at stake in Fort Da? What's the object of the game? Well, the game itself is the object, but the gone part of Fort Da, we've talked about this before, is in some sense, you can't create priorities out of plus and minus of Fort Da gone in there. There is no prioritized symbol between plus and minus. It's the alternation of plus and minus that matters, but it's the lack, it's the minus that appears first, and that's misleading to say, because to say appears first, to have priority in terms of time, makes no sense. But with what we've talked about before, pressurized time, this anticipation, this anticipatory dimension of the subject that is the symbol, what we mean by that is all of time is sort of condensed in that. Once we get to the end of the object, so the supposed point of its arrival, which never does arrive, then it retroactively alters what came before. But we need that, what he says before, that threshold. We need that lack. We need that moment of anticipation for anything
right.
to appear.
Yeah. And thinking about the whole notion of double inversion, double reflection, what is being reflected on or hooked on is, so far as the imaginary needs to reflect on itself, because the imaginary, the spawn of the ego, is an image that needs a sort of anticipation of its own, but it's not like pressurized time yet. Until it reflects upon itself, it can only do so by creating the word which allows it to admit itself, right? Because I think he mentioned something about the word needs to come through for something to exist. We could think of the word like the trimethylamine in the dream of Freud, where the subject originates, or whatever it is, that signifier that allows the admittance into the symbolic order. And it's not a positive identity. It's like, I think she mentions a -1, that we could see the subject being in this process of negation through inversions, right? Not just a lack, but even as it tries to relate upon itself, it's always inverting the prior to the prior. And I think this is the importance that he mentions in the optical schema about the plane mirror. So we're always reflecting off of a virtual point and relating it back to that, but it's never concrete. It's a non-being that takes a life of its own.
And that becomes the stuff of literature and tragedy and cinema. But I think, yes, this dimension of anticipation is so important to keep sight of, because it helps to prevent us from lapsing into any kind of Jungian or object relationist false certainty of
Right.
the final moment of the object's arrival, of the fully fleshed out phallic to combine flesh and phallic there, realization of an object of libido. And just to bring it back down to earth, I think for anyone listening to this who would want to relate this to any kind of anti patriarchal theory, any kind of theory that criticizes the patriarchy. Well, here it is. This is where there's a lot of potential for a really incisive critique of, let's say, paternal structures, which are meant to be everlasting, and that, well, the object itself should be undermined. The concept of object itself, that is what Lacan opens up to us. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Right. And like the thing is that the common notion of patriarchy seems to believe that even though it's a system where women are exploited and overpowered, and it's a discourse dominated by phallogocentrism, a paternal function, they don't see the lack in the system. They think like, oh, somebody has the phallus or a group of men have the phallus, when it's like, no, the phallus doesn't exist. And that's the whole point of psychoanalysis, is to expose not only the lack of a phallus, but also the function of the veil and how we continue to maintain that. And so most of the time it's like subversion rather than, dismantling or realizing the lack of a phallus, because the phallus is a castrated object. That's also its impossibility. And I think like Freud, even though if you probably wouldn't realize it, Lacan shows this in his essay of the phallus. Should also shout out Mikey's blog of the phallus. Should probably drop that in the link.
For sure. Yeah. That's always the best place to start with any of these concepts. I also like Derek Hook's definition of the phallus. I think it's his, but an index of impossibility.
Right.
But let's get to, there's so much in here. I feel bad skipping anything, but at the same time,
we gotta
a lot going
time
on.
Limit. And
I thought this was funny when he says the male sexual organ for which you don't need any sort of theoretician to remind you of its surgings.
Yeah.
The uterus is a small animal which lives inside the woman's body, quoting Aristotle.
Yeah.
Theories of hysteria. Aristotle doesn't want to touch the phallus here, though. He's too. But
he's too essentialist. But it's also funny is that like for the most part, his like understanding of psychology, not only like in the soul, but I think he has like the notions of like the humors,
right?
So,
which would lay the foundation for medieval theories of medicine, even.
Yeah,
I think a lot of that derives from Aristotle, and I'd imagine Hippocrates. But
and Aristotle even had a theory of dreams as well, which cool. Of course Freud quotes in the beginning of Interpretation of Dreams, and yet he's not focused on a daimon or like a guiding spirit that may be part of that, or some relation to divination. Although the dreams reveal something, maybe you could say metaphorically, like in a divinatory way, but it has nothing to do with like a premonition or prophecy. Rather, it's what's revealed about the fulfillment of the wish, or to be Lacanian, the real, right? What the person's desire is, and why the compulsion to repeat always happens.
Well, I like what you're saying about desire and dreams. It definitely aligns into what Lacan is talking about here, to our dear Valabrega, who said in the previous lecture, well, a child's dream is undistorted, because if a child wants cherries, if the child desires cherries during the day, they will dream of cherries when they're sleeping. And the idea is that, again, there would be this direct one-to-one correspondence between desire and its object
Right.
that is distorted in the dreams of adults who, I don't know, are too caught up in the hustle and bustle and the everyday agonies of life to have
Right.
a clear and univocal object of their desire.
Right.
But
And yeah, one thing about that too
yeah,
is like with, even though Freud, coined the theory of regression in dreams, and Lacan's not down for it. It's like even if that were the case, if there was this 1:1 ratio in kids, like, oh, if they desired cherries in real life, they will dream about it. Well, it's like, oh, if they couldn't get the cherries, they'll eventually get the wish fulfillment in their dream because that's why they dreamt about it. And they fulfilled that desire of eating cherries in the dream. But it's like that's not the case if uh there is the drive to sleep and the compulsion to always repeat that same scene of mastery, which again is insistence, death drive.
but it's never one scene, is it?
It's never one
It's the
scene.
thing. What he says is that, yeah, but the baby, a child in this case, which is interesting because he also says whose talk has certain consonants missing from it also dreams of custard and cake. And just like the person starving to death dreams of Pantagruelian meals, not just a hunk of bread and glass of water, which shows that there just is no proportion here. There, as you said, there is no ratio. Desire wants to amplify its scope beyond the need to which it corresponds. Now, that's not so much of some amazing insight until you realize that, well, the need itself is retroactively defined in terms of this disproportionate mirage,
Right. Yeah.
generated by the dream. So you would think, but the need surely is the thing that's just biologically definable. It's easily understood. We know where it comes from. Hunger is hunger.
Yeah.
Thirst is thirst. But then once you get to libido, if you're just like, well, the drive to have sex is just that. Well, now you're getting into some really murky waters.
Right.
But it's like, no, the need itself, which we can say there are needs. There is such a Maslow's hierarchy is not completely arbitrary. Is that it, Maslow? Yeah. It's not completely arbitrary. It's not. I'm not trying to reduce this to kind of bland postmodern relativism. It's just that the moment we start to talk about needs, they become infused with the symbolic already.
Right. And it's like the same thing about exchange value and use value. It's like
exactly
something doesn't become a need or of use until it's like already exchanged in the symbolic order of different signifiers, because the need is just only something that you could think of retroactive to the fact that it is a desire. And not only is it a desire, but it's also in a circulation of a libidinal economy in which the object of desire is a lacking object. The fact that the symbolic order constitutes our drive and or our libido brings about an excess, which now it's like not only do we have quote unquote needs, but we also have things that have to be prohibited. It's like, prohibited needs, right? That still somehow end up invading the symbolic order. What is it? Zizek talks about how like we should see like libido or the drive like as some type of parasite, or the subject as a parasite that invades the body. That's exactly what we should see it as, or the undead thing. And that's what we are. It's like we're neither, human or not human. It's like, well, the subject and drive are like inhuman, right? We just keep on consuming and consuming. And someone like Bataille even sees this in how well, we always talk about economies of need and scarcity, but there have been economies before that in his book, A Curse to Share, and how excess has always been a thing. It's the fact that we've had rituals and sacrifices to be able to avoid off the excess. But capitalism doesn't have that, according to him.
To curtail it. Or
Yeah.
capitalism itself is the ritual spread out into every domain of life, de-ritualized ritual.
Yeah.
But now the ritual is living, is ritual. But another thing you were saying about use and exchange value made me think of something I watched recently. I forget the name of the channel, but this guy talking about how these con artists basically hiked up the price of mint condition video games, retro video games, NES and Super Nintendo video games to millions of dollars. And it was interesting because it's like there are a lot of these channels where they're supposed to be doing the work of a good Samaritan, or just by exposing these scams. But in doing it, it's interesting because they need to do a cursory definition of how things develop value. And the host of the channel was saying, well, things have extrinsic and intrinsic value, but it's human nature to want something that is desired by many people. And even before this kind of technology existed, I think in the 18th century, there was a craze for buying tulips. There was this, and then things, of course, swell to the point of the bubble bursting and lose all value. And these are general laws of an economy. But I just thought that was interesting because it's sort of this strange, misconstrued attempt to reckon with exchange and use value. And I think Valabrega almost, when he's talking about the dream of cherries as being a sort of untainted dream, like one that has yet to be mutilated into the sundry forms of desire as are experienced in adult life, let's say, kind of repeats this logic of like there, an object, a commodity has this essential use value, which is perverted over time by, I don't know, just like being caught in the back and forth dynamics of almost like Rene Girardian sense of like how desire works.
And it's like, and it's funny because like right there to only understand need, or the way that the concept of need is evoked as this sort of indestructible substantial trait or instinct within humans. And right there, that's already recognized through an inversion, which is, of course, the commodity. Because you said it's like, oh, these commodities have this, substantial value to it that makes it useful for humans and their needs. But it's ironic also because it's never human needs that are put at the center of a capitalist economy, because it's really commodity production, labor power. But really a libertarian bro would be like, oh, we need to get rid of the state because this is destroying our freedom, and we need to let the market play itself out, because at the end of the day we need the market. So it's like, well, you said it's all about human needs and our self-interest to satisfy them, but then it's like, oh, we have to care about the market more. The market is also an inversion of that need.
No, that's really cool, because it's like, and then your typical sort of NPC ML bro idea is that, well, we'll get rid of all this confusion of needs and desire just by having a state that provides services to all of its members, and that'll be it. And then
Right.
we'll wash our hands clean of all this commodity use value, exchange value, perverted desire structured sort of economy
Mhm.
of life. And it's not
Yeah,
that
and like just to kind of cap it off, like whether we're talking about psychoanalysis, post-structuralism, or someone like Baudrillard, like need is a myth, right? And even the NPC ML bro is still caught in that illusion of like, oh, if we just get rid of this, then everybody will just have their natural needs unalienated by the productions of labor. It's like, no, there's an excess, it's excess to produce, even if there wasn't or to consume, even if there wasn't capitalism. So, like, art is not like this based need that will just satisfy us immediately. Like, art is something that is of excess, or poetry, whatever,
and useless. I
yeah.
know people like to say, oh, society needs art. We need art. And then there's always a kind of wishy-washy, vague explanation for what art provides. Oh, it helps us reflect on the human condition. It brings us more in touch with our emotions. It helps us dream. It's always just resorting to poetry to justify the role of poetry. But
Right.
ultimately, it rests on this idea that there are needs beyond immediate biological needs, and those are the needs that make us truly human.
Right.
It's like, no, everything is already mixed up with everything else. But
Right.
can we, before we take maybe a 5 or 10 minute break, talk about what he says here about resistance? I think it's interesting because when we talked to Derek Hook, he quoted this exact sentence here. There's only one resistance, the resistance of the analyst. I think this
Right.
is really interesting because, just to bring it back to what we were talking about before, the object relationist wants to surpass resistance, wants to break through it so that we can get at this desire and give it its correct, suitable, the object which is appropriate to it, and resistance is getting in the way of that.
Right, and that's the deadlock that he says, because the idea of a deadlock is then introduced because of both resistance and the fact that, well, we're talking about the subject's desire and enjoyment, and so if like sublimation is the key for understanding the drive, or how do we bring satisfaction, because it's funny, he talks about this instance in the deconstruction of the drive in Seminar 11, that there is this antinomy between enjoyment and resistance, because the drive is all about enjoying, and we obtain sexual satisfaction in the sublimated sense as actual enjoyment, but yet the resistance from the analyst, even though the analyst wants to situate themselves as the object cause of desire, may bring about resistance of set, what is the enjoyment? What is the name of the desire?
One of the things that stuck with me, one of his statements from Seminar 1 that really stuck with me, was when he says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but transference exists in all domains of life, but resistance only exists within the session, because there's no such thing as resistance unless analysis is supposed to be occurring, unless you had expectations of your analysand that they should say something meaningful, that they should arrive at an epiphany earlier than they are, that they should have a breakthrough, that they should stop waffling around and evading, and that you're training them in a sense to near the object of their desire with a certain expediency and intention.
Yeah.
And no, you're missing the forest for the trees there, because resistance itself, if it's really registered, observed with the attention it
Yeah.
warrants,
And
then you get, that's the very royal road
to the unconscious.
Yeah. Well,
Oh,
obviously dreams are, but that's, here's another one. That's all I'm saying.
yeah. And no, like, and it's also interesting because it's like you don't want to add that resistance, because then it impedes the repetition of the drive within the transference, because it's like, well, the analyst knows they have to make the, if they're a good Lacanian analyst, or how Lacan wants them to be, good Freudians, will situate themselves as the object cause of desire. But at the same time, even knowing that, it's like you have to bring this resistance within this transference, or you don't have to, it's that it comes about in this conflict, in this deadlock. And also knowing that, like, as soon as the temporal pulsation of the unconscious arises, like, you're already too late by the time you realize it. And you can't try to force it, because that becomes resistance.
Who that reminds me of? Our good friend Oedipus. It's always already too late.
He's already too late
when he realized something very important. But we're gonna get into that, because I've got a lot to say about old Ed there.
Ed.
Yeah, the last thing I want to say about resistance here, and it reminded me of way back when we were talking about inertia, and I love the way he puts it, because he's saying, okay, you say that your patient is inert in this moment, or no, you're trying to get at, you're trying to get past the resistance and get them up to speed, in a certain sense, on what you've already noticed. That they're like, why are you not realizing this? What that one guy says in seminar 1, you just want to rattle them, like, you idiot.
Yeah,
he's
and
like,
make yourself seem more intelligent than they are.
But he's saying you're the idiot, because resistance is already an abstraction, and you're trying to get rid of this abstraction that you put there, because the analysan isn't asked to do anything but one thing, right? Say anything that comes to their mind.
Yeah.
Other than that, they don't have to do any. They don't have to talk if they don't want. Like, they don't have to do anything but pay for the session, continue to show up, and say anything.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like,
that's a perfect observation. Yeah.
So it's like, you have to keep that in mind. But this idea that, okay, you put it there in the first place, and you're trying to get beyond it. That was interesting. Break time?
Yeah, we should take a break.
All right.
Yeah, I need to get some water. My mouth is dry. All right.
Jumping back in. So now we get into Oedipus. Oedipus Eddie. Here we have a figure that perfectly condenses these themes of desire, lack, and the symbolic. For this section here, I made sure to go back to Ethics of the Real, which I was saying before has, to my mind, the best sustained analysis of the Oedipus myth anyone could find anywhere. And it definitely chimes with what he's saying here about Oedipus. Thoughts?
Well, I would just say that really, I think on this one he goes back over and talks about like he reassures that at the time that Oedipus, what does he rip off his eyes or rip out his eyes, and then he
He
realizes
stabs
that
his eyes with needles, I think like knitting needles or something.
right, and it's like it's that point where he realizes like who he is, or like the subject that is unconscious to Oedipus. But I think what Lacan says, he mentioned something about like not taking that as like some universal archetypal cure, in the sense that we could just reduce that for every neurotic subject, which I thought was really interesting, because he emphasized that, you know, if there's like a correlation between the myth of Oedipus, its logic, and I guess an obsessional or a neurotic in general, but we shouldn't reduce fundamentally what's happening exactly to Oedipus in this manner with every certain case. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
No, let's do some debunking for our DNG brethren
Yeah.
who might be watching right now, so that they can be becoming demystified
Yeah.
of some of their misconceptions of Oedipus. One, Oedipalization is a failed process always, by definition. If Oedipalization means what happened to Oedipus himself, it didn't. Oedipus is the one figure who is exempt from the Oedipus complex. Does not have the complex, but is of course the founder of a new order based on this complex, which I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but basically it's like, okay, when we were talking to Daniel Tutt, his take on Oedipus, which definitely works well with Zupancic's take, is that we have a failed initiation. Oedipus is not ultimately initiated into the symbolic order. He does not become a true subject because everything for him happens in reverse.
Right.
Now, Tutt would say the Oedipus myth is a parable about independence, whereas for Lenka, it's about the birth of the symbolic order and the contingent stain or remainder, which is not the desire of the mother, which is not a substance that predates the appearance of Oedipus, not or the fulfillment of the prophecy, but rather an effect, pure effect of the signifier itself. And that what we have here is a myth of the generation of the signifier. And generation is a good word here because in Oedipus we have condensed many generations. Whereas other myths, the other Greek myths all have a similar structure. There is a level of defiance to them. The heroes of these myths are given a kind of task. Think Joseph Campbell, think Jung, think the hero's journey.
Right.
They have to complete these tasks, overcome obstacles. In Lacanian terms, they would begin in a state of imaginary rivalry. This is all Zupancic, by the way. They would begin in a state of imaginary rivalry, and this is commonplace Lacanian terms. She turns this on its head, but begin in a state of imaginary rivalry, then get to the symbolic level after they have gone through some sort of ordeal, a trial, have overcome obstacles, faced an opponent, that opponent being the desire of the mother or jouissance, the thing, and only then can they be truly initiated and become subjects. They're awarded with the daughter of a king, usually.
You're right. Yeah.
This story, everything's mixed up because the conditions for Oedipus's entrance into this symbolic order, or for his birth as a subject, have already been laid out, and it's only after he, how would I put it? It's only after he arrives at the point that he understands what these conditions are, that the stage is set for his birth, that he finish the thought for me. What am I getting at?
So, well, one thing, it's like he's pretty much like you said in the Oracle, right? Oedipus is predicted to, kill the father and marry the mother, and yet he is not born yet. But it's like this, not only the subject, but also the order of knowledge that comes with it is already brought upon before his birth. And in order to stop that from happening, like the father gets rid of him, right? Sends him to another kingdom. And so what I have a question of, would that be in a sense of a failed initiation to the symbolic order because of that? And really he wants to go back to find them, and in the process, like, he kills the father without realizing it, right?
Remember, here's the word, you just said it, realize. Remember, realization was a word, or the French word realization was a focal point in the previous chapter. Well, to realize, to make something real.
Yeah.
But also to gain awareness of something. Same process. For him, the making real, the coming to pass of his fate, the prophecy, or parole.
Yeah.
The prophecy, the word itself, which is his destiny, is one and the same with its becoming real. Not to sound too D&G there, but am I made man in the hour when I cease to be? Subject arrives too late.
Exactly.
Right? Always arrives too early, too late. He realizes in both senses the conditions of his own being in the moment when he is a non-being. Here's where it gets interesting, and why Oedipus is more, according to Zupancic, even more complicated than Hamlet, in that, so we already know that entering the symbolic order involves debt, that the debt is related to desire, and language itself, one incurs debt by being a subject of language, a speaking subject. One is constitutively guilty. But what Zupancic argues is that Oedipus is the one figure who is not guilty. The other Greek heroes are proud of their guilt. They're Promethean in that sense.
Right.
They boast about their guilt. Even if they're punished eternally, they take pride in the fact that they transgressed. Whereas Oedipus didn't transgress because he didn't know he was transgressing.
Yeah.
So in that sense, he's a one-off character. And what I wanted to say was that his strange innocence is that she also points out the fact that he doesn't kill himself after this realization. He blinds himself, which means that he, in that sense, we could say, petrifies himself in the moment of his own impossibility, the own impossibility of his being, and becomes a thing, becomes the thing, becomes the initiator of a new symbolic order, but not the initiated, never
Yeah.
the initiated.
And
That's the fascinating thing.
And you know what's interesting thinking about it, because when you were talking about how all these other myths, right, and you right now use Promethean, another thing is like there's always, even if there is a tragedy, there's always a resolution or a message that you could gain from them. I don't know if there is a message that even the Greeks knew for Oedipus, if not Oedipus being a mystery to the Greeks themselves, right? And it's also something that even, questions or even tries to bring into fruition, like what is the nature of man or the essence of man, especially when, if we talk about Oedipus being the progenitor of the symbolic order, well, then he's also a man because he solves the riddle of the Sphinx.
What's the word he says?
He says man, right?
What, anthropos,
Yeah,
right?
anthropos, yeah.
Man.
You know,
The word itself, it's the enunciation of the word itself that brings to bear
right.
his fate upon the reality of his being, because he uttered the word itself.
Right. And when you think of it like compared to like a Promethean, the Promethean believes in freedom of this holistic man. It gave them the fire so that they could be, illuminated. But there is no illumination to man in this one. It's like you don't get the fire which brings out this knowledge. You bring maybe like a non-knowledge.
A non-knowledge, and this is why the Zupancic talks about the knowledge that knows itself and the knowledge that does not know itself. The knowledge that doesn't know itself is, of course, you were talking about this recently, the enjoyment that links signifiers together. And it's also the knowledge that does the work, as Lacan puts it, does
right,
the
because there is
work of living.
Yeah, because again, as you said, jouissance, and what it is, it's like it's not only about knowing, but also being able to participate in what is enjoyable, because that's also part of this injunction to of the superego, which is the misrecognition of the law, right, and a transgression of the law itself.
But when I think of, though, like jouissance, or the non-knowledge doing the work, we're afforded breathing room by gaining non-being, which sounds paradoxical, but gaining non-being affords us the breathing room. What's given up in exchange is being. It's a choice of being versus non-being. And then the being of unconscious knowledge, though, ultimately determines what your life will be. However, the moment I think the two forms of knowledge meet up are in the Sphinx, are in
right. Isn't that kind of like what you just echo right now, similar to like Zizek's is it Zizek or is it Lacan again that says that uses the whole like thing about like the robber coming up to you saying your money or your life, and so you have this choice between either giving up your money or giving up, or encountering death. And so it's like they become symbolized, and it's like, well, what is money like in that example, if not like giving up something to maintain or to enter into the symbolic order, right? Which brings about the possibility of death.
But the idea is that without money, you can't live a life.
Right. But what is money but debt, right?
True. Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, what makes it complicated, and I think maybe an even better joke is the one he tells here about the cake and the liqueur, which is that you go to a bar, you order a cake, You're given the cake, then you order a liqueur.
Mm-hmm.
You give back the cake. The guy says the liqueur costs this much, and he says, I already paid for it with the cake. And he says, but you didn't pay for the cake. And he says, but I didn't eat it.
Yeah.
So it's not a fair exchange. It's giving something you don't have to begin with.
Right.
So it's complicated, but what you were saying before about -1, you don't start from 0. You start from -1.
Right. Which represents lack, right?
Which is right, because lack is not 0.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Lack isn't just void either.
Mm-hmm.
Lack is -1.
And it's a less than nothing to be Zizek.
Less than nothing.
Yeah.
And that's the minus sign. That,
mm-hmm.
But it's not, you give it over. But this is the fascinating thing. It's like that with the symbolic exchange, it's not something you have to give.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes it fascinating. And the symbol itself is a form of
right. And this is where we go back into like the understanding of inversion and the birth of the signifier in S1 and Zizek's elaboration. It's like it's already an inversion of what doesn't exist. Like what's gone is the real image, right? So that's also the -1.
Which the real image was already an inversion.
Exactly, especially when we look at the inverted bouquet in the optical schema.
Yeah. The invertedness that's already at the heart of reality. Mm-hmm. What else? This whole chapter is really beautiful. It's very dark, and
see how many pages we got left. We only got like what, 3 or 4 pages.
Yeah. But there's so much going on here. This is like also something that Hooke said once, is that in extreme cases, the suicidal patient isn't someone who just wants to die, but someone who wants to never have existed.
Yeah.
And this is what Oedipus brings to light, is that really it's that what he is deprived of is the imaginary reconciliation or imaginary closure that masks the pure contingency of meaning. Because without that, you see just how arbitrary the signifier is.
Especially when you say that it's not that they desire death, but they desire to have never, lived in the first place. Most of the common language that you see, like very depressed or suicidal patients say, is like, I feel numb, or just I want to feel nothing at all, right? It doesn't, even though like we would assume it's death, or like maybe like a sort of therapist bro would see it as like, oh, they desire death. It's like, no, the desire to be inanimate or inert for the most part, as what is the death drive but this return to matter, right? And the point is like, well, it's not the fact that they're suicidal that they're desiring it, but there is something that's being exchanged in these signs or signifiers in the unconscious that are supposed to take the place for the subject, right? And what the subject's desire is. Or did I say that wrong?
But here's what's interesting about what you're saying, though, is that to just want to die is to want to cease to exist. It's the cessation of life. But what is more complicated than that is to have never been is also a kind of gain.
Yeah, exactly.
Gain the status of having never been, which is exactly the joke he's going to make here. It's not a lot of jokes here. You really see where Zizek gets his steez from, but where is it? It's right here. Yeah. It would be better not to be born. Unfortunately, that happens to scarcely 1 in 100,000. to not be born, which is that expresses it right there, because it's a gain, as he says,
Yeah.
it's in the calculus of probability. So we're still at the dice roll. We're still at the level of the coin tosses in a
Right.
sense, but it makes no sense though. It's completely at loggerheads with itself.
Right. And it's because like to live it, whether it's living or dying, it's never in the sense, for psychoanalysis, it's never in the sense of like literal death, right?
Right.
Although that could be it, we're talking about a symbolic life or death. And what it is just the undermining of the symbolic identification, which is the ego ideal, right? And what more to not, or to desire never having been born, is really to show that you can't, like, to try to identify with the symbolic order and live up to the injunction to enjoy and to be considered man in relation to other men, as he says in Logical Time. That right there is what's at stake. It's the fact that they can't find enjoyment in others, and especially for an obsessional, because it has to deal with this living or dying in the symbolic sense. And what more to not necessarily die symbolically or literally, but to be the slave to the big other, right? A big other that's already dead, an other that's already dead.
Yeah.
Right.
And that
it puts you in the position of the slave, and therefore you're being told what to do or how to feel, how to think. But that's the paradox itself, or a contradiction.
You're like that Japanese soldier who lived on that island for decades after World War II, thinking that the war went on. But I don't know if you've ever heard of this
No.
Japanese soldier. I think there were a few of them that were discovered decades after World War II, living, off in a cave or something, living off the land. And it's sort of, you need to remain the slave of the big other, work obsessionally for the master signifier that is the Emperor of Japan, let's say, if only to keep at bay this knowledge that the big other is dead, this this needling fear, this needling suspicion that there is no big other, that the big other is dead. So even if it's a tyrannical big other, one that you hate, and you see this, nothing sets this in relief better than just work life, any kind of workplace. It's swarming with obsessionals, and they hate the big other of the job. Always, they're constantly complaining, but they will absolutely bend over backwards to satisfy what they imagine its needs are. And that's not for lack of imagination so much as for absolute fear that what they define as this despotic authority doesn't exist. That's much more frightening.
Right. Especially, like, to use like the work example of, like, corporate and all that. Like, even if, like, most of the time people are laid back, like, the idea is, like, you shouldn't say something offensive. Not that I care, but somebody else might.
Yes.
This isn't like corporate spirit. These aren't the corporate values of, like, I don't know, Starbucks or like Walmart or something like that. It's this adherence of the law of the big other of a Walmart or a Starbucks. But it's like it's already a lack to begin with, and it can only be reified by that manager position that sees themselves as, an instrument of the big other, right? Maybe, or just someone who wants to be an object for the big other, which is more of the hysteric type thing. But if it's an obsessional, then, right, what they fear is being taken away from that, right, relation that says how to live, right?
Right. Would you say that the obsessional then will find people in life, maybe friends or partners or whoever, people, someone who for them embodies the big other?
Right, but at the same time can never fill that role and it ends up castrating them, right?
Someone who is believed to be the source of their castration.
Yeah.
It's better to have a person,
Mhm.
someone in particular who embodies that. But so he goes into more. I want to read this to the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, this character from I like how he just calls him Edgar Poe. He leaves the Allen out, repressed signifier. But this character from a short story who is in the moment of his death hypnotized and basically frozen in this liminal state between life and death, and is an echo of the liquefaction of Oedipus, neither person nor thing, the real essence of what it means to be
Right.
totally human. But I just want to read this. I
Yeah.
just want to read these whole two paragraphs. I know you got to sign off when you got to sign off. So maybe we could just
Yeah, we could just
end it
read a couple
here.
passages. Yeah,
Which
because
we should, because this is just so fire.
yeah. No, yeah, let's read this.
Oedipus at Colonus, whose being lies entirely within the word parole proffered by his destiny, makes actual the conjunction of death and life. He lives a life which is dead, which is that death, which is precisely there under life. It is also where Freud's lengthy text leads us, where he tells us, don't believe that life is an exalting goddess who has arisen to culminate in that most beautiful of forms, that there is the slightest power of achievement and progress in life. Life is a blister, a mold, characterized, as others beside Freud have written, by nothing beyond its aptitude for death. That is what life is, a detour, a dogged detour, in itself transitory and precarious and deprived of any significance. Why, in that of its manifestations called man, does something happen which insists throughout this life, which is called a meaning? We call it human, but are we so sure? Is this meaning as human as all that? A meaning is an order, that is to say, a sudden emergence. A meaning is an order which suddenly emerges. A life insists on entering into it, but it expresses something which is perhaps completely beyond this life, since when we get to the root of this life, behind the drama of the passage into existence, we find nothing besides life conjoined to death. That is where the Freudian dialectic leads us.
That was some good stuff right there.
Yeah.
But like right there, it just like shows like the already anti-Oedipus. I mean, would you say they are anti-Oedipus that already exist in Oedipus that most D&G bros don't understand? It's like as if like it's just purely this historical thing that we just need to deterritorialize from. But it's like to be certain about that and in the way they do, it's like they're already reifying Oedipus in this perverse way, or they're trying to be in the sense of psychotic speech or discourse, but then they put themselves as the big other without realizing it, or affirm that a big other does exist in their attempts of trying to say that there isn't. Maybe they do think so, just like they say there's no such thing as ideology.
They redouble it.
Ideology doesn't exist, but they instantiate, in a sense, putting God back, bringing God in back into the back door.
Exactly. they redouble what they're so adamantly trying to kick out, right?
Mm-hmm.
What they want to oust from the scene does come back through in that, well, if Oedipus is part of this machinery meant to distract us from desiring production, then it is a remarkably efficient mechanism, right? Well, to what would does it owe its efficiency then? That's what I don't understand.
Mhm.
Like to the magic of the big other then, because there are elements of
Mhm.
magic here where you give your supposed enemy a lot of credit.
Mhm.
That's the way I see it. Whereas Oedipus is nowhere in particular. Oedipus is an asymmetrical figure who
Right.
is not ever defined by the socio-familial bonds which supposedly locate us, right? Or at least crisscross our subjectivity. And that
Right.
subjectivity is already problematic. We are constitutively guilty, but by being constitutively guilty, we're given a sort of out. We're given a kind of escape hatch, which isn't allowed Oedipus, and that's the tragedy
That is,
of,
yeah.
of Oedipus. And it's a tragedy of the signifier itself. Do you
Yeah.
have to bounce? I see you got your hat on.
Yeah, I gotta bounce pretty soon.
Okay, let's just
Is there any last words? Yeah.
Well, this part, I mean, this last section has a lot going on.
Right, because you
We
mentioned
talked about the joke with the liqueur.
Mhm.
It would be better not to be born. Happens to 100, 1 in 100,000 to be or not to be. I just wanted to, before we wrap up, if we could comment on this joke because Zizek tells it,
Yeah.
and it took me a while to get, I think. But the one you introduced me as an unbearable mother. Listen, you're marrying the daughter, not the mother, but she isn't exactly pretty nor a spring chicken. She'll be all the more faithful for it, but she hasn't got much money. You can't expect everything. It's like the pros that he's highlighting from these cons, he's counting,
Mhm.
right, as advantages, as reasons to marry this person. And then when she hasn't got much money, you can't expect everything. Like, look at everything else she has going for her, which is just what she doesn't have going for her.
Yeah.
Spun. um
But it's like, yeah, like pretty much like it shows that what makes her who she is what she lacks, right? That's what it seems like.
and he's enumerating the lacks
Yeah.
as if
Exactly. Yeah.
they amount to something. But yeah, desire desires a roll of the dice. Why is it only man who plays dice? Why don't the planets speak? That's a bar right there. Why don't the planets speak?
Yeah, exactly.
And he picks it up in the next chapter,
Right.
is the introduction of the big other. So we love when we come across certain terms for the first time, so talk a lot about the big other.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to bring it up. Seminar 2.
Exactly. We learned about dentists. Now it's time to learn about astronomy.
What
right.
sign was Lacan?
Huh?
What was his sign?
That's a good question. I think he was like Aries or something.
Typical Aries.
I think he was an Aries. Let me confirm.
Very aggressive.
Jacques Lacan. Jacques is. I'm pretty sure he was an Aries. Yeah, April 13th. 1901.
The date we should celebrate his birthday.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Wait,
Right.
that's my niece's birthday's the day after that. Wow.
That's funny.
Holy shit.
You
All
know
right.
that she's gonna be a psychoanalyst.
Maybe she will.
She's the reincarnation.
Oh God. Hopefully not. All right then.
All right,
Signing
man.
off.
All right. I'll talk to you
Next
later.
week. Peace.